This issue blew up in the literature after the release of an algorithm, or what we call a model typically, by a company called Northpoint, and the model was called Compass. And what Compass did was you fed the model details about people's criminal history and some other details, and it made a risk prediction. It either assigned them, it gave them numbers, but they were classified either low risk or high risk. What it was used for, not what Northpoint said it was supposed to be used for, but what it got used for was making predictions about, or used in decisions about whether to hold people who are arrested for pretrial detention. So someone gets arrested and we're trying to decide whether to release them on bail until their court date or not to release them on bail until their court date. And judges, parole boards, people making these decisions were relying on Compass to assign them a risk score for how likely they were to recommit a crime. If they had a high risk score, then that meant they tended to not hold them for pretrial detention. If they had a low risk score, they would let them out, roughly. So that's what it got used for. It will probably not surprise you to learn that when ProPublica is a public open access news source, did an analysis of Compass's algorithm, or the Compass algorithm, and they found that it disproportionately labeled black defendants as high risk. That's in some sense unsurprising that it would be biased in that kind of way. But this started a big fight because what they said was that Compass had a higher false positive rate for black defendants, meaning it more often labeled them as high risk, and then even if they were released, they weren't rearrested. So it mislabeled them as high risk and they didn't recommit crimes. It had a higher false positive rate for black defendants than white defendants. Also for males over women. Men over women. And then Northpoint responded and they said, yes, it's true that it has a higher false positive rate for black defendants, but our algorithm is not just, we just didn't make the most accurate algorithm, we actually calibrated for fairness. And calibration means something very specific. It means that for any given risk score, the chance of reoffense is the same independent of, say, race. So if you got a 6, no matter your race, you had the same percentage chance of recommitting a crime. Let's just say it was 60%. That's not true, but let's say that. So they said, our algorithm is calibrated, and ProPublica said, yeah, but it's got higher false positive rates. And then what some people were pointing out, and they both knew this, you can't have both of those. You can't both calibrate your model and have it have equal error rates. It's just, there's a technical, in most circumstances, you just can't have both of those at the same time. And so this started a huge fight in the literature on how to manage fair algorithms, and which fairness metric is correct. A fairness metric is one, equal false positive rates is one fairness metric, calibration is another, and there's actually just a ton of them that you could deploy. And so this started a fight. What's the right fairness metric? Should we care about calibration? Should we care about false positive rates? What should we focus on? And that's a debate. And then people were building algorithms and deploying those fairness metrics in various ways on their models and then trying to advocate for their favorite fairness metric. But this just misunderstands the normative issues of fairness that we should care about in several ways. So first, one important factor about fairness is that there's multiple types, and which type matters is context sensitive. So one kind of fairness we care about is what's called distributive fairness. That is, when you're going to distribute some benefit or some burden, some cost, you should distribute it fairly. But that's very different than another kind of fairness, which we call procedural fairness, which we want to make sure a process is fair, independent of the distribution of outcomes. So think about criminal trials. We're not like, we should assess criminal trials and make sure they're giving an equal number of guilty verdicts and an equal number of innocent verdicts. No, we want fair trials. And if it results in lots of innocence, that's great. And if it results in lots of guilty, I mean, that's maybe not so great. I mean, something bad about our society is going on. But what we want is that process to be fair, not the distribution of outcomes to be fair. And then a third kind of fairness is restitutive fairness, like making up for when we've been unfair in the past. How do we make up for that in the future? Like, maybe distributionally, we disproportionately advantage certain people in the past. So how can we recompensate for that in the future? That's a different kind of fairness still. So one thing to just wonder about Compass is, fairness metrics are about distributive fairness. Are we distributing results in the right way, so are we getting equal positive rates, or so that people have an equal chance no matter what their label? But you might strike you as thinking like, hey, shouldn't parole decisions be like procedural fairness, like criminal trials, and we shouldn't care about the distributions as much? But then you're just applying the wrong kind of fairness. But even if you think you should be thinking about distributive fairness, the context matters a lot. So now I'm going to tell you what North Point said the algorithm was for. It was supposed to predict, a high-risk score was supposed to mean that keeping that person from reoffending would cost more resources than someone that had a low-risk score. But there are lots of ways to spend resources to prevent reoffense. I guess one of them is holding people in jail. But another one is providing money to communities, providing after-school resources. There's all sorts of allocations you could give that would help people that were high risk score not to reoffend that aren't keeping them in jail. Now notice how these questions have very different judgments about whether it's fair or not. I'm going to label high-risk defendants that are black defendants are going to be disproportionately labeled high risk, and we're going to thereby hold them for pretrial detention at a higher rate. That sounds obviously unfair. This sounds way less unfair, it's at least an open question. Black defendants are going to be labeled high risk at a higher rate, but what that means is we're going to send more money to black communities to prevent offense. Maybe that's unfair still in some way, but it is a very different kind of fairness question, and whether you think the algorithm is unfair depends on the context. So not thinking you can develop a fairness metric that makes things fair is just insensitive to that.